Okay, so welcome everyone to a new Alexander Galetovic seminar. And now we have the privilege of having Harold James, whose book, Seven Crashes, we have it on the library of the university. If you want to see it, you can also purchase it. It's a book that combines economic history, finance, and other things. And we had him present. He's a professor from Princeton University. He will present his paper in about at most 30 minutes, I think. And also Kevin, we have Kevin Cowan, who used to be uh, in the supervising part of the central bank, the Comisión de Mercado Financiero, has a lot of experience. You all know him. He's a PhD from MIT, and he will discuss the book in about 10 minutes. So, and then we will open the floor. If anyone has a question of any kind, we can discuss it with you. So, thank you, James, for being here. It's an honor for us, and go ahead, please.
Well, thank you so much. It's really an enormous pleasure being with you, not in person, but virtual at least, Bernardo. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to talking also with Kevin later on. This book is, in a way, the outcome of COVID and all the things that followed from COVID, because I think we were then when I wrote the book, and we still are now, in a very confused time, and there's a lot of uncertainty. On the one hand, people are thinking about geopolitical fragmentation and the world splitting up into blocks and thinking that something like the 1930s could be repeated. In the 1930s, there was the United States was really pushing its influence all over Latin America. The British and French strengthened their imperial systems in Central and Eastern Europe. Germany expanded into this Großwirtschaftsraum, as the Nazis called it. And in the Far East, Japan thought that it would create the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So the world has seen fragmentation into geopolitical blocks before. And many people, and sometimes the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, likes to say that this world is being repeated. And she obviously knows something about that, in that she grew up as a child and a student in the divided world of the Cold War, when her country, Bulgaria, was in a different bloc than the West. So that's one vision of today. Another vision of today is that we're at this moment of incredible technical change, and we've got AI, and we were talking before the program, before the lecture began, about whether we could have a simultaneous translation via the subtitles into Spanish or other languages as well. But AI is really making enormous progress, and this looks like a technology that might hold the world together, because it's essentially very easy to cross frontiers with electronic communication. And blocks and trading systems and the kind of thing that we're discussing in the US election about tariffs and whether Donald Trump will impose a heavy system of tariffs, that doesn't look real at all from the point of view of electronic communication. That's a very different narrative. And then you look at what the markets are doing at the moment, and the markets are treating it all as if it's a enormous party, and they're going ahead, they're steaming ahead. So I thought, really, in these circumstances, we should look back at the past. And I've been thinking for a long time now about the history of globalization, and whether globalization moves in one direction in a unilinear way, or whether it changes course, or there are great reversals. Many people think of the 20th century as being broken in the middle, in this age when there was the geopolitical fragmentation in the 30s and 40s. That was also a time at which globalization fell apart, with restrictions on the movement of goods, restrictions on the movement of capital, restriction on the movement of people. So everything that was to do with globalization contracted in the 1930s. So looking at history helps, I think. And what I did in the book was to think about 7 key moments when globalization turned in one direction or the other. So one of the chapters indeed looks at the 1930s and the Great Depression and the fragmentation then and how that story played out. It also looks, and each chapter has a discussion of how economists at the time or theorists at the time discussed the problems. And it won't surprise any of your listeners, any of our viewers, that the figure I drew on to think about the Great Depression, in a way, the most obvious choice of all was the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, who, in a sense, produced the answers to the Depression, and then the answer also to the question of how to reconstruct an international financial and monetary system after the Second World War, as one of the key architects of the Bretton Woods framework that met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944, and created then the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. What I did in the book, though, was to try to distinguish 2 types of shock to the world economy. One, a demand shock, like the Great Depression, where the problem is then a deficiency of demand, of aggregate demand, and it's nicely analyzed in Keynesian terms. So that's the world that, as it were, produced Keynes, and what the world experienced over 15 years ago now in the great financial crisis in 2007, 2008, looked also like a demand shock, a negative demand shock, in the sense that both the Great Depression and the global financial crisis, or the great financial crisis, I don't really, maybe we can discuss this, I don't like the word global for the 2008 affair, because it's really, as many people have pointed out, it's much more of a North Atlantic financial crisis. It doesn't involve China. It doesn't really involve most of Latin America. Europe comes to it late. So these 2 moments were negative demand shocks, and the solutions to that are, I think, really straightforward in terms of creating aggregate demand and also a non-contractionary monetary policy. Both of those crises followed from financial crises, and it's financial crises that make for the contagion in the Great Depression and in 2007 and 2008 as well. What I thought was also really striking, looking at the history of globalization, and maybe there I will just try to share one slide. I hope you can see that. This is the story of globalization in a relatively simple measurement of globalization as thought of as the relationship between trade and world output. And you can see really 2 moments of big surges of globalization. The one in the 19th century, from the middle of the 19th century to the 1870s, is striking, but obviously less dramatic than the one that follows from the 1970s. And both of those surges of globalization in the 19th century and in the 1970s followed from not demand shocks, but supply shocks, negative supply shocks in both instances. You might think, how do you distinguish them? Conceptually, it's relatively easy to think of it in that in the demand shock, prices and volumes of transactions or volumes of goods traded or volumes of goods produced move in the same direction. So prices are falling in the Great Depression and trade is falling and the output of factories is falling. In the negative supply shock, on the other hand, the prices are rising and the volume of goods being produced and the volume of goods being traded falls. So we can be relatively simple about it. When prices and output move in a different direction, we have a supply shock. We can also imagine a positive supply shock, and there is a positive supply shock round about here in the 1870s. That is, the volume of goods produced increases dramatically, but the prices fall. So that's a positive supply shock. But it seems to me, and I look at that a little bit, but the most interesting ones are these negative supply shocks in the middle of the 19th century and in the 1970s. And they have a kind of common pattern. That is that there's an acute shortage of something. In the 19th century case, in the middle of the 19th century, it's a shortage of food. And it's most pronounced in Europe, in Northern Europe, of all, most in Ireland, where Ireland had become dependent on a single crop, the potato, and a series of cold, wet summers produces the spread of a fungus, the potato blight, so the crops rot and people are starving, food prices are going up, large numbers of people die. About 1 million Irish people died in the Great Famine, and another million or so emigrated, mostly across the ocean to the New World, to North, but also to South America. In the case of the 1970s, it's much more of an energy shock, although there is an element of food shock as well, in that there's a harvest failure in the Soviet Union, which was then a great grain exporter. And so food prices are rising as well. So you get something of the middle of the 19th century effect. But it's energy with the two oil price shocks, 1973 to 4, first of all, and then in 1979 again, following the revolution in Iran. Both have a tremendous impact on the world economy. The immediate reaction to both of those crises is to think that existing institutions have failed completely. And to some extent, that conclusion is right. How the British government dealt with the Irish famine, for instance, is a story, a tragic story, really, of criminal mismanagement of policy. So at first, the government sets up food kitchens for hungering people. Then that strains the trade balance. The Bank of England puts up its interest rates. It's more difficult to finance the government debt. And the government, in the middle of the famine, cuts back on the food support program and says instead that the Irish people need to be fed, but with money raised by taxation in Ireland. So the taxes on the not extremely poor, the taxes on everybody else in Ireland are put up, and the consequence is that those people think that they're failing as businesses, and they migrate, and so the suppliers, the small shops, and so on, collapse. So policy has failed. In the 1970s, we had exactly the same story, that in one country after another, governments collapsed. There were coups. You obviously don't need to talk about coups with you in Chile. Western Europe, Northern Ireland, terrorism, Red Brigades in Italy, fascist terrorism in Italy, the Red Army in Germany. And there was a famous political scientist from France who wrote a book called How Democracies Die. So democracies, whether it was the Allende democracy or democracies in Europe looked vulnerable in the 1970s. So the feeling that governments have failed. And then the solution after that is actually to think of opening up as a way of securing more and better and more reliable and cheaper supplies. So in the 1850s, the British government, and then one government after another, first of all, France made a free trade treaty with Britain, and then more and more countries signed on to this with most favored nation clauses in their trade treaties. And the conclusion was very clear. It's only by expanding trade, by more globalization, that you could remove the source of political and social malaise and unrest. And indeed, in the 1850s and 1860s, the European countries stabilized themselves. And for the first time, incomes were really growing quite considerably and employment was being generated. So globalization looked as if it was supplying the goods. The 1970s had a repetition of that kind of mechanism as well. So many governments at first thought they could deal with the crisis by themselves and they could find national solutions to the crisis. It was a discussion that was particularly intense in the UK, where many theoretical economists, the Department of Applied Economics in my university in Cambridge, was very much pushing that position, said that you need to introduce tariffs and we need to manufacture more at home in order to absorb the unemployed and create greater prosperity. By the end of the decade, that view was on the retreat everywhere, and governments opened up. And the opening up started actually with center-left governments, with Jimmy Carter in the United States. Jimmy Carter's just had his 100th birthday, with James Callaghan in the UK, the Labour Prime Minister in the UK, who went to the IMF, got an IMF program and had a really quite intense budgetary stabilization. But then that's followed by a move, as in the United States, to deregulation that was then carried further by Margaret Thatcher and in the United States by Ronald Reagan. And a moment of opening elsewhere as well, the greatest of those openings, I think, in the late 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping starts the opening of China and the reforms in India. A discussion about opening starts then, but isn't really concluded, isn't decisive until the 1990s. So, that's a story of a political change that goes from thinking that you can manage by yourself to going in the direction of an opening of the world economy and a reduction of tariff barriers and trade liberalization. Those are the trends that you see reflected there. There's something else, though, that I wanted to point out in regard to this particular story, which is that these are also moments of technical change, or technological transformation, if you like. And what happens at these moments when there's a negative supply shock is that technologies that are already there have been developed long before have a new use and can be applied in a way that's truly revolutionary. Just to give you a sense of that, in the middle of the 19th century, that technology is the steam engine. And the steam engine is old. There was a steam engine already in the early 18th century. The most sophisticated patent for the steam engine comes in 1776 from Matthew Boulton and James Watt in Britain. But the steam engines are applied really just in very, very fragmented, localized uses. Most of them at first are stationary steam engines, and they're used above all to pump water from mines. In the late 1820s and 1830s, some countries have railroads, but only very, very small bits of railroad. So the first railroad in the world, I believe, is in Yorkshire in Britain, between Stockton and Darlington. There's a railroad in the Pennsylvania collieries in the United States, a railroad between Nuremberg and Fürth in Germany. That's 5 kilometers long. But these are not going to be transformational. And what the food crisis does is to make people aware that the railway can be used as a network and linked up also to steamships that are sailing across the oceans, and that this is going to reduce the cost of transportation dramatically and make it easier to import, in the first instance, foreign grain and then foreign resources, so that it's that development of the application of steam to transportation that takes the world into this new era of prosperity, where you see in the 1850s and 1860s growth everywhere taking place. In the 1970s, the equivalent of that is the container ship. And again, the container ship is not like the steam engine, it's not completely new. There was one container ship, I believe, in the 1930s. In the 1950s, there's a regular container traffic between Florida and the port of New York. But it isn't enough to make a network. And if you want to have an integrated world, you need to have container ports in every continent. And very often there's resistance to that. Labor unions don't like it. It's obviously taking away conventional docking jobs. And so it's only at a moment of crisis that there's a possibility of getting round those obstructions and thinking of an opening up. So the crises are moments at which there are big incentives to innovate and to apply new technologies. And this really brings me to 2020 and the COVID pandemic. So I think we can think of the COVID pandemic as a similar supply shock. That world trade gets disrupted, the ships are in the wrong places. You've probably all seen photographs of the ships piled up, waiting to get into the big harbors in Hong Kong or Shanghai, on the west coast of the United States, port of Los Angeles. The shipping is in the wrong place. The cost of shipping soars. There are shortages of key components. Those shortages balloon out. And you get then shortages of semiconductors. So all kinds of things can't be done because there's not enough in the way of computer chips to innovate, and there's a big demand for electronic equipment at this time. So shortages, and then the effect of the shortage also highlights the importance of vulnerability to supply chains, and it creates, I think, a link to the geopolitical turmoil in the same way as actually the middle of the 19th century did. So the middle of the 19th century is also followed by a war in Crimea, the first really big interstate conflict since the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon in Europe, the Crimean War between 1854 and 1856. So one background, I think, of President Putin's decision to go ahead with the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 is the fact that Western Europe in particular is dependent on Russian gas, Russian energy, there's some oil as well, but above all on Russian gas. And the Middle East and also bits of Asia are dependent on exported Russian and Ukrainian wheat, and that is also then constrained by the fighting in the Crimea and in the Black Sea and the Russian naval presence in the Black Sea. But it's not just Russia that does that. You can think of other examples. One that Europeans sometimes get worried about is that Spain is a big importer of Algerian gas, but Spain also exports some of that gas to Morocco. And Algeria and Morocco are locked into a territorial conflict in the Western Sahara. And one of the things that Algeria then says in 2020 is if you're going to export gas to Morocco, we're going to stop our gas supply to you. And then a whole series of restrictions follow from that. Or you can think of the way that battery technology becomes more important. And with the battery technology, people in the People's Republic realized that the PRC controls a lot of the minerals and rare earths, gallium, germanium, that are dependent, that are crucial for battery technology. And so you can threaten to restrict those. So everybody is locked into thinking about supply chains. And we're still now in 2024, really very much in this world, in that the escalation of conflict in the Middle East is also a question of Iran using proxies and the Houthis in the Red Sea as a way of disrupting global connections. Can we see the same kind of breakthrough as existed in previous eras of supply shocks, of negative supply shocks? I think we can. And maybe the most obvious one is the way in which the vaccine is used to treat, prevent the spread of the COVID virus, or to diminish the gravity of COVID infections. And the mRNA vaccine was something that was developed, it's like the steam engine or like the container ship, a long, long time ago. It was in the 1990s that the experimentation with mRNA vaccines started. But at that time, it was thought that they were just useful to treat relatively rare tropical diseases. And it was only then immediately in January 2020 that the possibility of using them to meet this new viral threat became a reality. The vaccine was developed very quickly. And then as it is demonstrated as a success, people think of the application of vaccines to similar vaccines, mRNA vaccines, to other common sicknesses, including many common sorts of cancer. So a medical revolution is beginning, but I think you can also think of the acceleration of the AI revolution, which has been very, very rapid over the last 4 years, as the same kind of reaction to a negative supply shock. So the way in which the world is being transformed is really a consequence of breaking down resistance to employing new methods. So in both cases, in the 40s of the 19th century, 50s of the 19th century, or in the 1970s, there's resistance to the new technology, obviously, because there are traditional transporters. They have a lot of jobs. In the shortages after 2020, moving to remote working, working from home, moving to telemedicine, finding AI uses that are transformative in education as well. Just doing the kind of thing we're doing at the moment, having a seminar, a virtual seminar, so that we don't need to travel thousands of miles to meet each other. That's accelerated by the pandemic. And so I think in these ways, the historical models actually generate, for me at least, a sense of hope and possibility that we're not really sinking back into the world of the 1930s. But in order to get this kind of shock, you really need to live through very unpleasant experiences. And so I concluded the book with a quotation from the great British economist, John Maynard Keynes. We talked about Keynes a bit before, but this is Keynes writing in 1919, when things are very, very gloomy. There's the pandemic of the influenza, there's the aftermath of the First World War, the crippled economies of Europe, the uncertainty about how things are going. And Keynes writes in 1919, all this makes it increasingly probable that things will have to get worse before they can get better. And I love that sentence. Things will have to get worse before they can get better. And the can get better offers the hope that politics will respond in an open way and not to close off, and that those politicians who try to close off will actually see very quickly that they're producing ineffective and irresponsible policies that need to be reversed by somebody else. Thank you so much.
Thank you a lot, Harold. I will put your slide down, okay?
Yep, I can stop that.
Okay,
now.
great. Okay, now we have Kevin. You're muted. There? Yeah.
Yes. No, I think I'm fine now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much, Bernardo, for the invitation. And let me just start by saying it actually really was a pleasure to read Harold's book. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. And I think as Harold himself said, it actually is a very timely book for some of the questions we're discussing today in the global economy. I think Harold put the point clearly in terms of saying that faced with the dual shocks of 2008 and the consequences of the global financial crisis, and in particular the response to the global financial crisis and the stress that is generated on terms of politics, fiscal expenditure, expectations of a more equal rescue position and things and so forth, interacting with COVID. So I think that is actually very relevant. And for a country like Chile, which after several attempts has moved to be a very open and integrated economy, certainly the way this global discussion ends up is key for our economic future. As Harold, I'm sure well knows, we went through a very rapid period of opening in the late 70s. Financial deregulation has been somewhat less linear, but we now have a very open current account and a very open financial account. And I think in general terms, a broad perspective that the economy has done better because of it. So let me just put very briefly what I understand the main lessons of the book in a summary, and then just sort of go on to discuss what I think are some of the additional policy implications and economic discussions beyond the ones that Harold mentioned. So I think the main thesis is really that global crisis, be it supply, be it demand, are determinant factors for the direction of policy, politics, trade, and innovation. And obviously, how these interact and the relevance of each of these four factors depends on the shock. Harold mentions that supply shocks have the capacity to generate potentially a more positive outcome in the long run because of the price incentives, which push innovation and opening, whereas demand shocks probably have less of a productivity effect and more of an effect on economic policy, financial regulation. And I want to come back to that later. I think Harold went through most of the key crises, but I think really the three that stand out sort of most clearly as sources of change, opening, and innovation are after 1840 with agricultural failures, World War II and World War II in terms of reconstruction, and the 1970s as a response to the oil shocks, so the successive oil shocks. So then I guess the question that Harold phrases, and that's something that the book tries to explore, is, so we have in the last 15 or 20 years, two large shocks, a very large demand shock in 2008. I'm actually comfortable with talking about the global financial crisis, because although it was obviously originated in the US, I think the spread in terms of financial markets was particularly global, although the consequences were amplified in Latin America and Asia, as had happened in previous financial crises. It certainly, I think, impacted most economies. And it was more, I think, an issue of resilience and having built up better policy frameworks that allowed us to smooth this. But it certainly felt, having been in the central bank in 2008, as a global event, at least in the financial perspective. So we have these two events that are sort of interacting over time, and this question then is how is this going to resolve? How is this overall, I guess, lack of enthusiasm about trade in some of the key global economies, in particular the US, with the switch away from trade from the Republicans, but also more recently from some levels of the Democratic Party, and certainly in other countries like the UK, despite having come back to a Labour economy, a Labour government, which should actually be more enthusiastic about undoing Brexit, but I think we're still very early in that economy. How this sort of retrenchment is gonna play out with the COVID crisis. So I think that's sort of the overall view of what the book does. And I said it's a fascinating book because in addition to this overall story, which I think sort of pushes towards what's happening in current global discussion, I think it has some very interesting sections which are, from my perspective, definitely worth reading in of themselves. I think the job Harold does in terms of the global determinants and consequences of the 1930s crisis in the US is actually excellent, because I think what we often end up reading is a very US-centric view of what happened. You get the idea that this is something that originated in the US and effects were potentially more through trade, but really sort of the way that Harold links it to developments in Europe, banking crisis, and in some of the countries that after the First World War, I think is extremely interesting. I thought that in itself was a great contribution. When you look at 2008, I think there's a lot has been written about the causes of the financial crisis, errors in regulation, macroprudential, and so on and so forth. But I think the discussion Harold put forward in terms of the botched attempts to coordinate a global fiscal and exchange rate approach is also very interesting, because despite this view that really countries did come together in 2008 and coordinate in terms of liquidity support through central banks, upgrading of regulation after a resolution, the attempt to sort of coordinate this in terms of a coordinate current account approach, I think also is extremely interesting. So I think the book has those additional insights, which I think make it very much worth reading, in addition to this global perspective. So just some additional thoughts and some implications for policy. I mean, I think Harold mentioned in his presentation, and I think the book also has a lot of emphasis on the consequences of supply shocks and their effects on trade and productivity. But I think also the book goes over, and I think it's I think a very interesting area is the consequences of the demand shocks. And my background is somewhat biased towards financial regulation, but I think if you want to look at the current financial regulation structure, you definitely need to go back to understanding what happened in 1930, what happened with the FDIC, with the SEC, with banking regulation, and potentially these did not generate productivity growth, but I think they were sort of key pieces to being able to sustain a more stable financial market moving forward. Obviously, this has been covered in other textbooks, but I think it sort of gets to the general idea that these crises in general produce this opportunity, be it through prices or be it through policies and politics, to implement changes that otherwise would have never got passed through. So when you're in the roaring 20s in the US, despite what you may have thought about the convenience of leveraging up through broker-dealers to pile into the stock market, it's very likely that the political establishment was not going to support that. And no matter how solid your view, how robust your stress testing view, you're not going to get it done. So I think it opens an opportunity. Something very similar happened in 2008. I mean, if you look at the documents in the Bank of Ireland, in the Bank of Spain, there were several technical reports that suggested, in particular, that the housing market was out of sync with fundamentals. Both countries were leveraging up. Unfortunately, it took a severe financial crisis to be able to get those ideas pushed into the mainstream and pushed back against the Bancos Cooperativos, the Cajas in Spain, and the housing development lobby in Ireland to get it. And I think that conclusion in itself, having been in a regular position, is worrisome and sobering, because it sort of gets to the unfortunate conclusion that often some of the reforms end up being done when things go wrong. And I think we should always take a step back and try to overcome that. And I think that really this time we're going to try to impose or move forward in regulation and changing financial regulation in ways that we don't need a crisis. And that's something, even in a seminar a couple of weeks ago, a local economist was arguing that maybe we don't need to regulate conglomerates in Chile because we haven't had an issue like that in the last 20 years. You know, like, well, maybe I think one of the advantages of having a view of history in other countries is that we don't need to go through the crisis ourselves to be able to learn those lessons. So that's one thing that is sort of in the book that I just wanted to highlight. A couple of other things, because I'm cognizant of the time and I want to give sufficient space for a broad discussion, is obviously underlying these crises are issues of resilience. And I think despite sort of understanding what the consequences of the crisis are, what the consequences could be in terms of accelerating positive reforms, ultimately they're extremely costly events. And I think countries have been learning from that kind of lesson, not only from a global perspective, but also from a local perspective. For example, Chile, although not directly involved in the 1998 crisis in Asia, was significantly impacted, and in terms of output and employment. And I think it allowed to sort of push forward a framework which has proved much more resilient after that, which is sort of a flexible exchange rate, tighter regulation, prudent fiscal policy. And I think it's that kind of resilience that we need to sort of be carrying forward, learning from crisis and try to put this into overall macro perspective. And then the other issue I want to talk about is what the book suggests for what I think is probably the other big defining issue of the next 10 years, which is climate change. I think one is obviously where we're going in terms of trade integration, movement of people, financial integration. The other is how we will deal with climate change in the next years. And there are several aspects of climate change which can be related to the episodes discussed in the book. I mean, ultimately, climate change is a very substantial supply shock. Or if you want to look at it from another perspective, is the increase of substantial supply shocks. This is not theoretical, this is very real. If you look at, for example, what has been happening to the GDP of Argentina in the last 2 decades at least, and probably you can go even further, a lot of the cycle can be attributed or can be related to varying patterns related to rainfall. As an agricultural economy, Argentina has been and still is very, and in fact, at least 2% of the drop in GDP over the last 2 years, this year it's recovering, was because of a severe drought. So climate change, we can now see as more severe shocks or more likely to have these shocks. And then what does the book tell us about the response? I think the optimistic view is that given given a flexible policy framework, allowing prices to adjust and innovate, we potentially can adjust to at least some of these shocks. And that sort of paints to a story of conversion towards batteries, solar. The issue I have there, or the question is that if we're thinking about prices, in this particular case, when we're thinking of externality, are we getting the right prices? And do we need to push this further in terms of subsidies and taxes to be able to let? So I think that's a big issue in terms of, despite what we had in previous crisis, the key role of prices, probably this time we need to be much more aggressive in terms of policy making to get the prices right. So that's one issue. The other issue is coordination. I actually found it really interesting reading the book, trying to build parallels on some of the responses we've been having to global climate change from previous crises. I mean, we had initially a period of very little response, to then to a certain extent coordination. We had the Paris Climate Agreement commitments. As time has moved on, and we get into some of the redistribution aspects that the book mentions, some of the issues have been watered down. So I'd actually be really interested in getting Harold's opinion on how the past and reaction to large supply shocks will sort of is informative to this discussion. I mean, it seems that there's positive signs in terms of innovation, some positive signs in terms of government coordination, but I think over the last years, I think significantly less dynamism moving forward on that. And finally, just a thought in terms of technology. I think beyond what you mentioned in terms of communication and the fact that we can have this discussion literally across the continent because of technology. I think one of the areas, at least in Latin America and Chile, in which COVID generated a significant push was in digital payments and digitalization of payments. And I think this is interesting because ultimately there are the convenience, efficiency gains from this, which in themselves are I think powerful. But there are also, I think, a series of other benefits that we can sort of push forward moving on. I mean, the facilitation of trade through digitalization of payments is one area. Financial development is another. Once you have a small firm, which usually was out of the financial sector, being brought into payments, you open opportunities in terms of accessing credit, improving knowledge through credit scoring. So I think that, and it's interesting because it seems to be very much the case of what you were mentioning, Harold, before that. The technology was there, and you needed a significant push to get things going. In the case of Chile, I think it also coincided with a couple of regulatory changes that made competition easier, and so we had innovation in issuance and acquire. But if you look at the numbers here, but not only here, if you look at the numbers in Brazil, Uruguay, Peru, Colombia, I think this is a very interesting development and potentially something that will go on creating productivity growth. And interestingly, also a highly interconnected technical innovation, because really once you start moving into digital payments, the borders to what is the local payments providers, how you generate remittances actually start eroding. And that is something which is extremely challenging from one perspective, but I think also potentially growth enhancing for another. So as I said, a very interesting book, timely for what it implies in terms of discussing the future, and with a whole bunch of other issues which I think complement sort of, at least for me, what I understood about some of these global crises. So thanks very much, Bernardo, for pushing me to read it, and I certainly enjoyed it. I look forward to a reaction and future discussion, Harold.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin.
Do you want to react? And in the meantime, I'll ask everyone if they have a question, they can write it in the chat or raise your hand. If you want, you can write it in Spanish so I can translate it. Si quieren hacer preguntas, pueden escribir en el chat o levantar la mano. Si por tema de inglés quieren preguntar en español, lo escriben y yo la traduzco. Okay, you can react, and then we can see if we have some questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Yes, I mean, really great comments. And can I start from the most recent one and then work backwards? I mean, indeed, the question of the revolution that comes with digital payments is an absolutely crucial bit of the way in which I think it's possible to adapt in innovative ways. And again, it goes back some way, I think. In a sense, this is something that happened at the time of the global financial crisis in the early phases, but it doesn't really get much attention in conventional narratives of the financial crisis. So 2007 is when we think of the US mortgage market going crazy. But it's also the year in which Apple introduced the iPhone. 2008, when the world system is disintegrating, is when Kenya gets the M-Pesa, so a digital payment system that you can do with a quite simple telephone. And the beauty of this is that it allows a kind of leapfrogging in that you don't need any more, particularly for poorer countries, you don't need to think of building complicated networks of copper cable or optical fiber cable. You just depend on the satellites to do this with the mobile phone technology, and it's radically transformative in its effects in. Particularly, I think the studies I know best are the ones in Africa and also in India, that you can cut middlemen out of all kinds of financial transactions with farmers, so farmers can see prices directly and they can respond to that, and that's actually lifting people out of poverty. So the story is one of a transformation, and I think this is some of the explanation also why the pushback on trade policy, to get to the first point that you made, is so varied across countries, that it's in the old industrial countries that there's a sense of failure or of not adapting properly or of missing chances or of being overtaken. Whereas in the rest of the world, it's good to speak about this with Chile. But in many parts of the world, there's a sense that globalization is still offering a lot of chances and a lot of opportunities, and you need to connect with the international markets. So, one of the famous stories that has emerged in terms of thinking about the China-US relationship is that China-US trade is pretty stagnant. According to the figures, it's not really decreasing that much. In relative share, it's decreasing. But a lot of the action is taking place with the United States buying more from Vietnam or more from Mexico in particular. Those two countries have been the subject of a lot of attention now since the original article by Lara Alfaro pointed this out, and you can show this with individual factories in Mexico and Vietnam. The smaller the country, the more likely you are to think that only trade openness will rescue you. The temptation to go for really high levels of protection is really only in a few countries, a few very big countries. And so mostly it's really an American story or a Chinese story. And in part, it's a story also of Europeans thinking, can they do something like that in Europe? And the answer that I think is obvious to most people is no, you can't do that in Europe. And that's not the way that Europe historically worked. It raises an interesting point, I think, in regard to your question about the energy challenge and the green transition, because the move to more protectionism is something that is going to slow down the green transition and make it more expensive. And people are thinking about this already, and it's fascinatingly presented in the very recent report a couple of weeks ago that Mario Draghi coordinated on European competitiveness. And, Draghi says rightly, with solar panels, it would be foolish to think that you can build up a European industry because the Chinese industry has so many cost advantages and it's got so far ahead. And Chinese solar panels are so really cheap. And this is something that, in the same way as digital technology is offering a leapfrogging effect, this offers a leapfrogging effect in that if you think of installing solar panels, particularly in southern countries, in tropical countries, it offers tremendous possible gains. So Pakistan is full of Chinese solar panels. And then Draghi reflects on electric vehicles, and electric vehicles are much more contentious. Should the United States basically continue on its present course? So there's little difference there between what the Trump administration did and what the Biden administration is doing, and what the new Trump administration would do if it were elected, of trying to keep out Chinese electro vehicles. Well, that's actually where one of the stories from my book, I think, seems to me to be absolutely applicable. That this reminds me of the story of the 1970s, where the United States, for a long time, thought that it could respond to the energy shocks by keeping energy prices down in the United States. And with low energy prices, the American automobile producers continued to produce these high consumption vehicles, gas guzzlers. Whereas in Germany, or more spectacularly in Japan, the energy prices moved up quickly. They didn't think that they should hold the energy prices down. And the automobile producers have a big incentive to move quickly to fuel efficiency, and they produce fuel efficient cars. And the result is that by the 1980s, it's clear that the American automobile industry has really lost out on something, and the costly restructuring that takes place later is costly and painful, and the kind of policy approach that follows from that, it seems to me, is to be more liberal about the importation of Chinese vehicles. I mean, in part also, you're seeing a big dispute in Europe about how that particular issue should be handled. Germany is suddenly slowing down on the idea of restricting electrical vehicle imports from China. And for the rest of the world, electrical vehicles are really, I think, a no-brainer. They are a way of making the energy transition quicker. And it comes down, I think, in the end to what Kevin said very powerfully, that these things react to prices and to price signals. And if electrical vehicles become cheap in the way that solar panels have become cheap, then they will be used everywhere, and you can at least move some of the transition through this. The alternative in terms of thinking about more nuclear is also, I think, being driven very quickly by changing technology, because energy prices are still high at the moment, and they're likely to remain high for some moment. It's not going to go away immediately or very quickly, and that's exactly the moment when alternative energy production will move in. If you try to protect and seal off markets, and if you try to manipulate the prices, all that you do is slow down the transition and make it more costly in the end. So I do find the lesson of the 1970s actually helpful, not just for thinking retrospectively about the energy shock of that time, but thinking about the question of climate change and making a green future, carbon neutral future, which clearly is the next kind of shock question that will come up if you're thinking of, you know, what this book looks like in the future. That's indeed part of the transition.
Thank you, Harold. So I have two questions from colleagues, and then we wrap up, I guess. So one is from a sociologist, which says, if you have kind of an idea what if some types of technology are a push for more globalization, and some kinds are like act against globalization. That's number one. And the other one from an economist is about that the COVID, one of the results of the COVID crisis was the diversification of supply chains. So do you believe, by maybe from what you have studied, that it might generate some decentralization on research and development, given that now more places have to produce manufactured goods and we cannot not only depend on China? So those two questions, basically. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Those are both great questions, and actually in a way linked to each other. So the first question about whether some technologies push for deglobalization and some push for more globalization. Yeah, I mean, it's right that, you know, I thought of the big revolutions in transport as basically pushing more globalization. But what happened in the 21st century, and also a little bit of the story of not the collapse of globalization in the 2010s, but the slowing down of globalization in the 2010s, if you look at that figure that I put up. Some part of it is due to the way in which it's easier to replicate production facilities across the world and to make production more local. So the best example of it, I think, is the so-called 3D printing of parts, so that you can then generate parts of automobiles in much lower run production levels, more geographically dispersed. And people, even before COVID, were talking about the reshoring or onshoring of production as a result of technology. So some of the technology is doing that. Having said that, the advantages of scale production and the complexity of supply chains is still very much with us. And the second question was right about that, that COVID highlighted the problem of supply chain complexity, but it didn't produce any easy solutions. And indeed, the solutions, if you think about them, really need a considerable amount of time. So an example of that, one of the things that terrifies Europeans and Americans, maybe people elsewhere as well, is the dependence on semiconductors that are produced in Taiwan, the kind of phenomenon that Chris Miller looked at in his beautiful book on chip wars. And that's not a problem because Taiwan is an enemy, but it's a problem because Taiwan is potentially vulnerable. And there's a big move to diversify and to build facilities in the United States or in Europe. There's a big production from the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, in Arizona. But it's going to take a long time before that's actually complete and starting to produce. In Eastern Germany, Intel was going to build a big chip factory, but then they decided that they're actually producing an outdated kind of chip there, and so it's not worth building the factory. It's very, very difficult to be nimble in this story, and I think all the production chains we're trying to make them more resilient, but they're very, very complex, and we can think of pharmaceuticals as well, that a lot of the world's pharmaceuticals, generic pharmaceuticals, are made in India, but a lot of the Indian generic pharmaceuticals are made with Chinese raw materials, and there again, it will take many years before you uncouple. And so I believe even in the really big countries in the United States or in China, you will see that you actually need something that is made somewhere else. China, because over the last few years, the campaign of the Chinese government against the tech giants has resulted in a slowing down of innovation. And so the United States looks more innovative. And if you cut yourself off, or if the Americans cut you off from the Chinese market, you're slowing down your pace of technical change and your capacity to adapt and adopt innovative solutions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Harold. Thank you to Kevin. We're going to upload this video, and thank you so much for coming. Have a good day.
It's good to see you. Thank you.